I know you will, Reese. Okay, let's go to the Lord in prayer before we begin this morning. Good morning, everyone. Our beloved Carol Quinn is not here this morning. I am going to be maybe a little off today. I'm used to seeing her pretty face there sitting in front of me. Carol, I hope you feel better. We're going to say a prayer for her and ask the Lord for the blessing for this morning's study. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for this study. Just thank you for the book of 1 Samuel. And thank you for your word. We're so blessed that we can come together and study every Sunday morning and just learn much more about you as you interact with David and Saul and ancient Israel, Lord. And so just guide our hearts and minds to the things you want to teach us, the things we should learn through this book, Lord. And again, that we grow separately, individually, but we also grow as a group, as a church body, Lord, encouraging one another in your word, Lord. And some of us are sick, not feeling well this morning. We think of Carol, who can't be with us. I just pray for her. I pray that you touch her body and help her to feel better as the day moves on, Lord, and that she can come back and join us very soon. So just heal her this morning. And again, once again, that you would just be with us as we study your word. And just thank you for all that you do for us. And pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we will do, of course, we already know our routine by now. We're going to be doing chapter 24. So we've had numerous amounts of lessons, and we're going to start, as usual, reviewing last week. So we're going to review the second half of chapter 23. We're not going to be in any notes, Joan, when we start. We'll just kind of go over what we studied, get ourselves up to speed, and then we're going to go into the notes. Now, some of you might want to open up to 1 Samuel chapter 24 at that point in time, but you do not necessarily have to do that because I have the scriptures right here in the notes. So as soon as we're done our review, we'll go right to page 1 of our notes and start reading there. All right. Let's review last week and kind of get ourselves back on track. Where were we at? What happened last week? Well, we do know recently David has been running for some time. He's been on the run from King Saul. And he's been on the run for quite some time. He had been into Gath, and that didn't work. He then went to the cave of Adullam, and then in the stronghold, quite possibly on the eastern side of the Jordan River. He moved back into Judah by instructions from the Lord. And he moved into the area of the forest of Hereth, which lied in his tribal territory. Next, he went south and rescued Keilah and stayed in that city for a short while. And after their betrayal, David moved even further south inside his tribal territory of Judah into an area called the wilderness of Ziph, moving from stronghold to stronghold, or as we said, from Metzad to Metzad. Now, one such place was called Ha-Haresh, or what could be literally translated as the woods. Now, it was at this point that Jonathan decided to go and find his friend David and offer some encouragement. And I pointed out last week how easily it seemed that Jonathan found David. Meanwhile, his father, King Saul, was having a really hard time pinning David down. And we know that is with specific reason, the Lord God's reasoning, God's purpose. Now, Jonathan revealed, once again, what I think is a very informed and spiritually mature set of truths. I mean, Jonathan knew some things and believed some things, and maybe originally not given him as much credit as we could. But we see with this interaction with David, how much Jonathan really understood. It's pretty amazing. He said to David, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul, my father, will not find you. And you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul, my father, knows this also." So Jonathan states that his father would never find him because Jehovah, their God, was his protector, and because the Lord keeps his promises. David will one day be king. And in a statement which made me sad, Jonathan says that when the Lord brings about his will and David comes into his kingdom, he will be by David's side, reigning as his second in command. Now we know that this isn't going to happen because him and his father and his brothers are going to die on Mount Gilboa, unfortunately and sadly. But at this point in time, Jonathan says, when you come into your kingdom, and it will happen because God's going to bring it about and keep his promises, I will be right next to you reigning and ruling as your second. So after confirming their commitment to one another as the best of friends, they parted ways. But we learned that the Ziphites would not be so kind. They, in what I think is preemptive and motivated by self-preservation, send a delegation to King Saul to make it clear that they had not invited and have no intention of helping the fugitive David. Nancy, you made it. You're on YouTube now forever. Sorry. Nancy just arrived. She told me the other day she wasn't making it this morning. So they're trying to tell King Saul, hey, we have nothing to do with David. He's in our area, but we're not going to help him. And they offer to help David in David's apprehension. Now, the king is genuinely touched at their show of pity for his dire situation. But remember, he had been down this road before. He had been on plenty of wild goose chases in his effort to capture David. So he tells him, well, go back home and gather better and more specific intelligence about David's hiding spots and troop movements. Then he would come down to Ziph and join them for David's capture. Now, although not specifically stated in the text, the Ziphites apparently did a great job at gathering intelligence, and David got wind of something brewing. So he moved his men even further south into an area called the wilderness of Maon. Now, the city of Maon was located about 9 miles south of Hebron, and that is probably about 4 or 5 miles south of their current position in the wilderness of Ziph. So they move about 5 miles south, but unlike any other time since Saul began chasing David, this particular time, Saul was hot on David's heels. And that's why I think the Ziphites gave him pretty good intelligence here. This time he would not escape. As David began to find the best strongholds in the area, Saul and his men ended up on one side of the mountain with David and his men on the other side of the mountain, and David closing in on David's rank, and David basically literally surrounded. David was literally, when we got to this point of our narrative last week, David was a dead man. Now, strategically, we talked about this. Saul did everything right, and the reward was David's capture. But God intervened. God intervened. Using the Philistines' own purposes, national interests, reasonings, and choices. It means when the Philistines decided to invade Israel, it was their own choices, their own national interests. They had a powwow with the 5 lords of the Philistines and made a decision, we're going to attack Israel here at this time. So it was a matter of human choice, human will, with their own natural interests at heart. But God uses those things. God protected David by allowing the Philistines, this is the other side of the coin, to invade Israel at this exact time. The threat was so great, because lots of times we're thinking, well, Saul wanted David so badly. Why would Saul give up chase at this point in time? Well, it must have been a very great threat by the Philistines that Saul had no choice but to turn his men back and deal with the invasion. The very spiritually astute people of Israel, including David himself, understood that there was no luck here. We're not the only ones that say, this is no serendipity, this is no luck here, there is no coincidence. They did during that time as well. They understood God's hand in protecting David. Why do we know that? They named this particular mountain rock the Rock of Divisions, or Selah Hamalekot in Hebrew. Selah Hamalekot. This is the rock of divisions. God protected David by putting up a heavenly divide between Saul's men and David's men on the rocky hills of Maon. And amazing. Last week I ended with a summarizing statement. I say this: Satan wanted David dead because the Messiah would come through the family line of David. Make no mistake about it. Satan's hand is all over this. Saul wanted David dead because he threatened Saul's dynasty. God overruled both Satan and Saul because his will would be done. David would live, David would rule, and the Messiah would be born. The Son of David would walk this earth, and he would give his life as a ransom for many and later rule on the throne of David during the millennial 1,000 years rule on earth. Thanks be to God for his divine plan and his great love for his own creation. The way we ended last week. Okay, so let's move on. We end chapter 23 with with God intervening and not allowing David's capture. Saul runs back. He's got to defend Israel. The threat is so bad that despite tasting victory against David, Saul had no choice but to leave. And then we pick up chapter 24. So let's start in the top of page 1, the new notes. If you would like to follow along in the Bible, you can. I'm going to just read the first 3 verses, and then we'll break that down. Okay, chapter 24, moving right along. Got about 7 chapters left. Saul seeks David at En-Gedi. Now, verse 1, top of page 1. Now, when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Verse 2, Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. Now he came to the sheepfolds on the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. And so let's talk about what went on here in the first 3 verses. Now, first thing I want to orient us to is the map. So can you guys pull up the map? And we've seen this before. The very first map, David spares Saul's life. Thank you. So we can see and track David's movement. He was in Gath. You can see Gath up there. All right. He went over to Adullam, and then south of Adullam, he went 3 miles to Keilah, right? And then he traveled past Hebron to Ziph, somewhere in the Ziph area, all right? And then he got some good information that Saul was coming after him. He went south about 4 to 5 miles to Maon, was in the wilderness somewhere surrounding that area, and can everybody locate En-Gedi over by the Dead Sea? So in the interim, David travels a little northeast, all right? And he is in an area right on the shores of the Dead Sea, and we're going to get a good little background about En-Gedi and watch a video today, just a brief video and introduction. So let's talk about what is going on here. David apparently, right below the map, I'm going to start in the notes there, no longer trusting the strongholds of Maon, possibly because of his close call with Saul. All right? This interaction with Saul on this mountain, the Rock of Divisions, was so close, probably too close for David's comfort, and so he wouldn't stay there. Saul all but located him. So he moves his men into an area in Gedi. Strategically, this makes sense. He's going to go somewhere else. Now, En-Gedi means the spring of the kid, and this doesn't mean kid as a young kid. This is kid as in goat. So you could translate this spring of the young goat, or the kid. Now, there is a type, and we talked about this, me and George were talking about this last week. There is a type of wild goat that kind of adeptly navigates the steep rock cliffs, and this wild goat is called an ibex. An ibex. Very, very neat and nifty type of goat that patrols this area. And we're going to see them in the video. It's pretty amazing what they do. The cliff It's very steep. And you'll see these goats go just right across, traverse right across these steep cliffs. Pretty crazy. All right, they're called an ibex, really neat. Now, En-Gedi also is an oasis. It is an oasis. An oasis is a place where there's greenery right in the middle of the desert, and there's usually springs of water. And there's actually 2 different springs that come through the area of En-Gedi. So it's an oasis. And we visited there, George and Sharon and I, and we came right on down the coast of the Dead Sea. And believe it or not, when we come over a ridge and around the corner, right, you remember, there is some green. I mean, we're constantly seeing brown and oranges in this area. So there's a lot of shrubbery and greenery in the area. It's pretty neat when you roll up to En-Gedi. And we're going to see a little video, what it looks like. Now, in En-Gedi, currently, it is protected as an archaeological site and a nature preserve. And it is really, it's teeming with wildlife when you look closely. Basically, a zoo of desert-dwelling animals who desire its green foliage and rich water source. So animals kind of congregate here, as you can imagine. Now, most archaeologists reveal that the Dead Sea, which is now almost a mile away from En-Gedi proper, in other words, I'm standing on Gedi, I'm looking out, the Dead Sea looks like it's right there, and it is, but it actually is literally almost a mile from the center of En-Gedi, this area we're going to show. But in David's day, it used to be much closer. All right, and so over the years, the waters of the Dead Sea have receded. Some of the waters from the Jordan River, which feeds the Dead Sea, have been diverted. And so we don't have quite the same flow we do from the Jordan River. And so what they say is during David's day, the shores of the Dead Sea was probably much closer to En-Gedi as they are now. The Dead Sea has lowered at least by half, they say. So we say, in fact, En-Gedi might have been beachfront property, because 3,000 years ago, the Dead Sea was around twice its size as it is today. Lastly, the hills surrounding En-Gedi are littered with caves. So locating David was going to be like finding a needle in the haystack, which was one of the reasons why David moved here. We talked about the game of whack-a-mole, where the mole comes up, you hit it, and it goes back in its hidey hole, appears somewhere else. You're trying to play whack-a-mole. And so David could go into a cave with his men and reappear somewhere else and can move in and out of these caves. Very good hiding spots around here in this area of southern Judah is known for their caves.
How many men are with David?
600.
So you're trying to hide 600 men.
Yeah, right. 600 men. There are a lot of men to hide. It's okay. So yeah, needle in the haystack. You're going to need plenty of caves for that. You got no caves, you can't hide 600 men as much, so it's a little more difficult. Now we're going to watch a quick video, and hopefully this will give us a proper view, a little background on En-Gedi, what it looks like. So guys, can you tap up that video?
Not too far of a drive north from our pleasant stay at the Dead Sea is En-Gedi. To get there, you will drive through the desert on a highway that sometimes runs right along the Dead Sea. Depending on the time of year you visit, it will likely be hot or very hot. Buy some water. In a few spots around here, there are incredible natural freshwater springs that rise from the Dead Sea basin. One of these is En-Gedi, made famous by David in the Bible as one of his favorite hiding spots. The important biblical location of En-Gedi was declared to be a protected nature reserve in 1971. To the west of the preserve is the Judean desert, and the eastern border is the Dead Sea. In the desert, flowing water means life. There are 2 large spring-fed streams that flow here year-round. The area teems with life, and it is a very enjoyable place to visit.
It was here in these caves above me that David and his mighty men hid from King Saul, who was out to destroy the upstart warrior poet. David and his men had a pretty nice spot here, with food, water, and a vantage point that could see enemies coming for miles.
While the Jordan River to the north provides most of the water flowing into the Dead Sea, there are no outlets. And there are no outlets for the simple reason that the Dead Sea area is the lowest dry land on planet Earth. It's 1,300 feet below sea level. Now, given that water does not flow uphill, the fact that there is no outlet was one of those duh moments for me. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this. I keep hearing that there are no outlets to the Dead Sea and that's why it's so salty. Then one day, the light bulb went on. Well, of course there are no outlets. It's pretty much the bottom of the planet. Okay, I get it. There are many species of resident birds here at Ein Gedi, and these are supplemented by over 200 additional bird species that rest here during migration periods in the spring and fall. A gnarly-looking species of wild goat called an ibex is prominent here, and you will see them scampering along the cliff sides. Yeah, that's right, I said scampering.
Because of the water, the area is also known for its plants and wildlife. It's mentioned in the Song of Songs 114. My lover is to me a cluster of henna blossoms from the vineyards of En Gedi. Henna blossoms are flowers that are grown in this part of the world, and they're very fragrant. So fragrant, in fact, that they're used for perfume. And brides are often decorated with them on their wedding day.
That's good. All right, hopefully that gives you a nice picture of what En Gedi looks like. Of course, it's still hilly and rocky. And you saw those goats, those ibex, right on the cliff faces. I mean, they're sheer cliff faces, and they're navigating it rather easily. It's amazing. There's wildlife everywhere. There's birds, as they said, migrating. It's a beautiful place of greenery right out there in the desert. It's very hot. Of course, you still see there's lots of rocks as well. Lots of rocks, lots of caves. Anyway, that gives you a little idea of where David was hiding and what it looks like. All right, any questions over the video or any comments? I know we want to talk about our trip there. Now, we were behind ropes, so we weren't allowed to go in the cave like where he was. He got special privilege to go where he was walking. We didn't get a chance to walk there. You get a good overview, right? We had ropes and like a barrier we couldn't go through, but we could see it from a distance. But Mary.
A video like this gives us some more idea of how really rough it was on David and also on Saul looking for him to actually find one another and hide from one another.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like, going on level ground, makes you realize this was tough.
It was tough. Yeah, all the terrain was tough and rugged. And again, one of the things that the four of us learned is there's nothing flat down here. You're not going in like South Jersey and walking in one direct line. I mean, you're walking up and around, zigging and zagging, lots of rocks. Yeah, it's rugged terrain. And it was at least 15 to 20 degrees warmer once we got out of Jerusalem, which is a lot higher elevation. You get down here, it was hot. So we were cooking down there. George.
You were talking about the Dead Sea receding. And I had this picture of us riding down the road and seeing this resort sitting in the middle of a dry lake bed, and naturally it was closed. And do you guys remember that?
Yes.
And it was
Absolutely.
it was so bizarre, You're looking at this place and it's like, wow, it did go down, It went down a lot.
It did. Yeah, erosion and all the rest, has receded those waters of the Dead Sea. So it would have been a little bit more, it would have been definitely been higher. It would have been closer to the cliff edge during David's time. Like I said, it could have been beachfront property. I mean, he was right there and nobody was coming. And think about it, Saul's approach couldn't have been definitely at David's back to the east. He would have had to have come either southwest or northwest in some way. And so David would know the direction Saul would approach in Gedi, because he'd have the Dead Sea at his back. So that's where we're at. All right? Good. Hopefully we get a little visual. Pastor George?
The hill country that is to the west of En-Gedi is pretty high. Jerusalem's at 2,500 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea is 1,400 feet below sea level, so it's a drop of about 4,000 feet from Jerusalem down there. So that hill country is relatively high. So like David and his men have gone across the mountains here and gotten to En-Gedi, and there's really nowhere to go. Because, they can't, if they go out next to the Dead Sea, they're very visible. So they just have to continue to go from cave to cave there.
Right.
And they're basically, their backs against the Dead Sea.
Right. Yeah, and the one thing that advantage they have is the sight lines are great. No, Saul could not get anywhere near David and his men without David and his men knowing Saul's in the area. The approach is only one direction. So yeah, but you're right. He would have to be going from cave to cave, and it's going to come into play as to why Saul reacts the way he does, and why does he bring 3,000 men down to go after David. So we're going to see that. All right, good. Everybody good? All right, let's take a look at what else we see. Now, we're not told anywhere in Scripture, just in case you had a question, about the details of the Philistine threat. It's not in any other Scripture. There's no mention. We don't know anything about this Philistine threat that Israel gets at this point in time, not even through extra biblical source. And whatever ensuing pursuit or what Saul did or how long it took. We don't know anything about this threat and how Saul quelled the threat. But the author informs us, basically, in the beginning of chapter 4, that as soon as Saul returned from the conflict, it was reported to him that David was now hiding in the area in Gedi. So he had his spies out. And now he gets back, one of the first things he probably asked, where's David? Does anybody know where David is? And the confirmation, he's in Gedi, and Saul knows of this place. He knows where that is. So Saul gathered a contingent of 3,000 chosen men to find David. Now, En-Gedi proper was a large area, but David and his men could be anywhere near the oasis. It doesn't mean he's hiding exactly in one particular cave. His men could be spread out all along this ridge, anywhere there. It was a huge area to cover, and small garrisons would be needed to be left in specific caves or other hiding places, so David couldn't just circle back and hide in a place already searched. This is why 3,000 men were needed to find 600. So if you read this and say, why is he taking so many men? You leave a contingent of men by one cave, you go search the next cave, you leave some men at that cave, next thing you know, Saul is leaving other men at different cave sites, so David can't circle back. So that's his idea. He's going to take 3,000 men so he can leave them here, leave them there, and spread out in this area. That's why 3,000 are trying to find 600. And we've had this before, as luck would have it, right? Luck. David and a small company of men were in a cave, probably out scouting. I don't want you to think, and just honestly understand, 600 men weren't in this cave. All of David's men weren't in this cave. David and a contingent of men that he was leading, other men were probably somewhere else, but a contingent of men were with David. Into this exact same cave walked Saul, alone and vulnerable to relieve himself. Now, oh my, think about this. Here we have Lady Luck striking again. Lady Luck! Serious. How is this even mathematically possible when you think about it? I mean, out of all the caves and all the cliffs, Saul walks into the exact one that David and his men are in. I mean, talk about luck. That's just, like I said, mathematically, I don't know how mathematically this could even happen. But we aren't among the ignorant, right? We're not among the ignorant. There is no serendipity or luck or chance here. Isn't it amazing? that they walk into this exact cave. And from there, what happens as Saul walks in to relieve himself? Now, I did want to show you just a couple other pictures before we move on, just to show you how vast this area is from an aerial view. And again, I won't spend a lot of time here, but as you can see, if you look a little bit towards the center of the picture, you see all that greenery there, right in the middle of a desert area. So that's what it looks like in an aerial view. So pretty neat. It's a pretty large area. And Saul would have been coming from over that ridge with his men. He couldn't come from the Dead Sea area. He would have been coming west. So we're looking from east to west there. Pretty cool. Next picture is more of a schematic drawing of what it looked like in Gedi. That's the nature reserve right there. You can see almost like a horseshoe. There's a couple pathways that head up to the top of the ridge. There's some caves there, some springs of water. It's very, very just amazing and dynamic. I think in the right side of the horseshoe, you see what they call David's cave. And a cave he could have possibly hid in. There's a cave like sitting right there. Of course, the four of us saw that cave, and we saw the waterfalls that exist right there in the area. So really beautiful there. And again, I just wanted to give you an overall schematic view of the area to give you a visual as we study this. Saul and his men would have come up over that ridge. David and his men would have been spread out along this ridge, somewhere in and around near En-Gedi. Now, the next section, we're just going to look at verses 4 through 7. And I want to talk about circumstantial decision-making in the life of a believer. Circumstantial decision-making. So I want us to think about that when we read this section. Now, this is what happens. Saul goes in to relieve himself. Then this happens. The men of David said to him, "Behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. And it came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. And we're going to talk a little bit about why. So he said to his men, "Far be it from me, because of the Lord, that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed," he's talking about Saul, "to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." Verse 7, David persuaded his men at this point with these words, and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose, left the cave, and went on his way. So in these 4 verses, what in the world happened here in this cave? What exactly is going on? And so let's talk about that. See, when we talk about circumstantial decision making, let's talk about first the men. All right? David's men properly, and I mean properly, understood that this event wasn't coincidental. Can we all agree on that? They knew there's no way Saul walks into this exact cave. It's not coincidental. That's a great thought that these men have. That's an accurate thought that these men have. They're right. They're on the right track. God had brought Saul into this cave, and Saul made a series of independent decisions that brought him to this cave. His own decisions brought him to this cave. He decided when he came back from the battle that he was going to kill David again. And so all these independent decisions, choices that God did not make him make, he made on his own, and he ended up in this cave. Their conclusion, the men's, was clear. Ready? I think we understand this. The Lord had brought Saul into this cave in this vulnerable position alone. And what do you mean? Why was he alone? Why would he be by himself? Why would he be by himself? Saul was relieving himself, and I wanted to be clean here. Not number 1, guys, number 2. If everybody knows my meaning. Okay, if you know men, it takes us 30 seconds. We can use the bathroom and relieve ourselves very easily, and we'd be in and out of that cave pretty quickly. Okay, he's not going number 1. He's not urinating here. He's relieving himself. You need privacy, especially if you're a king. Nobody's going in there with you. Abner and the rest of Saul's royal bodyguards would be left outside somewhere. To them, This is David's men. It was clear, ready? This is their decision. The Lord set this up so that right now David could kill Saul, and because Saul was alone, he could kill Saul right now and escape undetected. This is from the Lord. Circumstances dictated the men's confident conclusion that God had ordered Saul's death here in this cave, and I will say to you, this is a valid conclusion. I mean, it makes sense. At least it's a logical conclusion. As a matter of fact, when I've read this, especially as a young man, I've always been like, David, come on. Is he being overly pious? I won't kill the Lord's anointed. Oh, come on. It's obvious that he should kill Saul right now, yet he doesn't. Well, to the men it was obvious. This is not serendipity. All right? Saul is vulnerable in the cave, and this is David's chance. The men are tired of running. It's over. It's over. He kills Saul right now, and they can stop running. They can go home and get a home-cooked meal. Go back to their own homes that they've left following David. Well, David, guess what? And I think we know this from reading this. He drew a different conclusion than the men. Same circumstance, totally different conclusion. He did something that must have shocked and surprised his men. He got up, he approached Saul, and he simply cut off a piece of Saul's royal robe, then returned to the recess, the back part of the cave, wherever they were hiding. Now, what do you mean? What is happening here? Well, the part that David removed was called a kanaf. A kanaf. Now, the kanaf could sometimes be a reference to the robe in totality. In other words, Rose would love this story. When Boaz, he threw his kanaf over Ruth, basically identifying his protection and loving care and kindness of Ruth herself. So when we read that in the book of Ruth, he spread his kanaf over her. That meant his whole robe. So it can mean the robe in totality, but in this case, it was a reference to the hem of Saul's garment, not the full robe itself. Now, what is the significance of this, that David went up and cut off the hem of Saul's garment? Well, the hem of one's garment was basically a symbol of their status. A hem was the edge of the garment, the bottom of the garment, that was rolled up and sewn. Of course, we understand what a hem is, right? But because of the expense, the very poor didn't have a hem on their garment. The edge was simply cut, and the bottoms were frayed to save on material. So if you were of the most poor, you didn't have a hem. You just had the bottom of your robe was cut and frayed. The wealthy had extra money, so their garment ends could be folded over. This would not only make the garment look nicer, but also make the garment obviously last longer. You paid more, and you get what you paid for. And so their hems were nice, folded over, sometimes decorative, but a king had the best hems in that they were usually large, they were decorative and ornate. Those hems were a symbol, right, of the king's power and royal authority, in a sense. Now, remember, this is why the Lord made King Saul strip when prophesying before Samuel earlier in our book. He wasn't allowed to wear those kingly garments and those beautifully ornate hems. They had to come off. And so you can imagine how beautiful they were, how ornate they were, and they were a symbol of Saul's authority. Now, David decided to cut off a piece of Saul's ornate kanaf, and he does this for a reason, to prove that he had no ill will towards Saul, to prove that he was innocent of rebellion. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And he would hold up this piece of Saul's robe, showing that he could have easily killed him, but he didn't. So David wasn't doing it in any way to embarrass Saul, but he was doing it to use as evidence that he could have killed Saul, but he didn't, in the cave. Now, he does this, and then again, if we're not understanding the context here, he starts to feel guilty. It's a prick of conscience. And you're like, what? For what? He could have killed Saul, but instead he cuts off a little piece of the material of his garment. I mean, big deal, right? It's not a big deal, especially in view of that he could have killed him. Why? Why was he feeling guilty? Now, this is not a one-for-one comparison. I'm just using a modern example to give us an idea here. But imagine if an army general was in the bathroom stall and he hung his coat over the stall and we snuck in and we cut off all his military decorations and ribbons and ran out the bathroom. Now, we would do that if he was an enemy or we wanted to embarrass him or something like that. So it wouldn't be the same as just cutting off a little piece of his military jacket. But imagine if we cut off all the ribbons and stole them and left. David, in his own mind, had showed little respect for the office of the king of Israel. At least in his own mind, he had committed a great insult against Saul by cutting off a piece of his kanaf. Now, observing a person as they were doing their business, number 2, stealing from them as they relieved themselves, even looking upon them during a time, was well beyond indelicate at the time. So you got to understand the culture. You just didn't do those things. And to do such a thing to royalty. Now, this indelicate operation of sneaking in and cutting off the robe just wasn't done. It wouldn't have been done, not even to someone's enemy. So it wasn't because Saul was such a swell guy that he felt bad about it. It's because there was a respect for the office of king. And this is definitely an indelicate thing. Now, here, I want you to imagine this. David did this thing, and he comes back to his men. Imagine the shock and surprise as David returns them, instead of having blood on his hands like they thought. I mean, they thought David was going to go forward and kill Saul. And here he comes back, and they're shocked and surprised because instead of having this blood on his hands, he's holding an ornate piece of Saul's cloak. And I want you to get that context as he comes back and what they must have thought. Wait, hold on a second. You didn't kill him? Since there was certainly some confusion and even some protest, David has to explain to them why he refused to kill the king. He says he already showed little respect for the king by stealing a piece of Saul's cloak. But killing him, going beyond this, was just beyond what he was willing to do, he explains. He refused, as he explains, to stretch out his hands against the Lord's anointed. That was his ultimate reasoning with them. I will not stretch out my hand and basically kill or murder the Lord's anointed. The word translated here as persuaded, and we see that as we read this verse. He persuaded his men. He persuaded his men. What does that mean here? It is the Hebrew word shasa. And it has a pretty deep, non-simplistic meaning. Understand this. It literally means to cleave, to divide, or to split in two. In other words, the idea is that David had to restrain his men, not physically. He had to restrain his men verbally, using words, from killing Saul themselves. They were so intent in killing Saul at this point that David really literally had to talk him out of it. All right, so he returns to them. He has the cloak. He explains to them why he won't do it. Well, we'll do it. We got it. We'll get this. We'll kill him. And so there was an argument. There was David, the leader David, talking them out of it. You're not going to do this. This is why. And so there's a lot more there. Shasa. He persuaded them. And then Saul leaves. We see that in the next verse. Any questions over the cave interaction? Top of page 4. I want to talk about this. How can this interaction in the cave become an object lesson for us? Because that's always the ultimate thing. We just talked about some truths. I try to put as much context in there as possible. Tried to give you what the idea was back then of what occurred and what was what does the language tell us, and what does the culture tell us, and what was serious and what wasn't serious, what was David's thinking, what was their thinking. But there's got to be an object lesson. Now, I explained earlier that the men saw this circumstance, David's men, as a sign from Jehovah that it was time to kill Saul. To them, they were very, very convinced. This was from the Lord, and the message was, kill Saul right now. Circumstances dictated their decision. Now, David decided something completely different. We already mentioned that. He chose not to do this, and this was not because he respected Saul. And I hope you get that from the context. It's not because he loved Saul. It's not because he respected Saul at all. Saul was a murderer and out of his mind. And we know this, he would not have afforded David the same courtesy, and David knows that. Saul wouldn't have afforded him the same courtesy. He knows that. But rather, what did he do? He respected the office of king that God had established. I mean, we see a culture nowadays who not only hate Trump, but they have no respect for the office. Some of the other side, the anti-Trumpers, will do anything, including cut off their nose to despite their face, if it would somehow, in some way, disrespect or dishonor Trump. They have no respect. You see them behaving like animals. They have no respect for the office of president. Right. Of the violence. No respect for so you could see and you look and say, at least have respect for the office of president. That is a great office established by God to run our country. All right. And at least do that. But no, there are some who don't. And so this is the opposite of David. He doesn't respect Saul. He doesn't trust Saul, but he respects the office, and he realizes that it is the Lord who raised Saul. And until the Lord removes Saul, Saul's the king, authorized by God to rule. And so there's an amount of respect there. So at least I think you can get David, even if you were with David and we decided, David, you're being over dramatic. At least we understand what David's thinking was. It makes sense as to why he didn't just kill Saul when it seems like, man, this is set up. It must be the Lord, right? He chose something different. David made a conscious decision this day, and I don't know if he even thought about it before. I think he made a conscious decision this day. Maybe the first time he thought about it, because he never had a chance to kill Saul. But really, this had to really put the decision before him. So he made a conscious decision this day that if Saul would be removed from his office, it would be the Lord's hand and not his. He would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed, and that was final. And we're going to see David follow through on the decision he must have made in this cave in En-Gedi. Two different conclusions from people in the exact same circumstance. Isn't that amazing? All lovers of God, followers of Jehovah, and yet they made two different decisions. Rose, you have a comment?
Yeah, this here gives us two items to learn by. The first one is respect the position. It's not the person, but it's the position. And secondly, it's a test for us if we're going to do the right thing or not. And it seems like David had a test to do the right thing, and he realized that it was the Lord's decision, not his.
Right. David, we know he's going to let the Lord decide. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move towards the end of this section, this chapter. Tom Bradford, sometimes I follow him. He offers some good thoughts, and I liked what he had to say, so I put that in as quotes. We're in the second paragraph, page 4. This is what Tom Bradford says about this section. David ordered that Saul was not to be further disturbed, and I explained that, right? You're not going to disturb him, let him go, we're going to let him go, right? Let alone attacked and killed. Another God principle leaps off the pages. Not every opportunity that comes our way, even if it sounds good, is of God. Not everything that would give us great personal gain is to be accepted. Nor is it necessarily, even if it's good for us, God sent. I thought they were really, really very insightful words. I agree with Tom. However tempting, an open path to success that comes as a result of our own handiwork or at that time of our own choosing doesn't mean that it is necessarily in harmony with God's will. It is always necessary to examine God's principles. We talk about it. This is Bible doctrine. Our worldview is a biblical worldview. We sift our truth through the words and the pages of our scriptures, the Bible. We rely on Bible doctrine and truth to make decisions, or we should all the time, right? And not only God's principles, or I would say Bible doctrine, he continues, and prayerfully seek God's purpose for whatever opportunities come along in our lives. In other words, we should be praying as well. They could as easily, these circumstances, be a test of faith and discernment as an unmerited blessing. They could be a trap from the evil one. What's our point? Just because a golden opportunity and circumstance presents itself does not mean that we automatically interpret this to mean that it must be from God, since this looks so good. Thus, we overlook God's counsel through his word and skip seeking his guidance through prayer is the main thing here. Now, I wanted to say this as a counterpoint. There are times, and here's the difference, that we are prayerful about a circumstance, and we've gone to the Lord, and then a circumstance occurs where it seems like it's from the Lord, and then you go and you make that decision that hey, this must be from the Lord, and through faith, you decide to do that, make that decision. That's different because you have sought the Lord, because you were prayerful about that situation. And so I'm not saying that every single circumstance that looks like a golden opportunity is something that we need to reject. The idea is you shouldn't, no matter what happens in our life, we shouldn't let an opportunity or circumstance that seems like it's the Lord's will to present itself. We make a decision without consulting the Lord and without sifting through the ideas and the principles that God's word gives us. We have Bible doctrine, we have prayer. Every decision we make should be sifted through those two things. And so I don't mean a prayerful situation that then all of a sudden something presents itself and you realize it's from the Lord. We've all had that, haven't we? That's not what the meaning here is. But this opportunity just popped up in David's life, and now he has a choice. Am I going to kill Saul? And he takes what he believes is the righteous choice. I'm not going to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, and I'm going to let the Lord take care of the situation, and he walked away. He could have easily, and if I was in that situation, Saul would be dead. I'm just telling you right now. I probably would have killed the man. And I would have said, it's self-defense. David had the Holy Spirit of God, and we got to give him a little credit here. Anyway, it's something for us to think about. I thought it was really neat about this. Any more comments, or other comments? Pastor George.
Yeah, the idea of the king and the authority that God's given the king. I think David wisely realized, when does it stop? If I take Saul's life, who's coming after David next, right? I think that's one of the things that are probably either in the Spirit's mind or in David's mind himself. If I topple Saul by taking his life, and then I become king, then the knives are after me.
Right.
So it's actually better for the nation that the king is honored than for me to just get rid of a problem.
And what Pastor George is saying, which is very astute, if David kills Saul at this point, he's the usurper. And there's going to be a portion of Israel that says David didn't do this the right way, right? He didn't gain the throne the right way. And there would be a portion, especially the tribe of Benjamin, who would have rebelled. You killed one of our own. You killed the king. So imagine what might have happened. And we only speculate, right? But that's a little bit what you're going, the direction you're going.
And the
right?
Christian nations in the West, always, we've started out with a lot of kings. And the idea was the king is law. And whoever's the king is the ruler, no matter how despotic he is. And throughout history, in European history, there was assassinations that took out the king, just what the men wanted to do, right?
Yeah.
And it turned into a chaotic thing where you were
Right.
king and then you were killed. And how many of our presidents have been either assassinated or shot at, right? It's probably one of the most dangerous professions.
Yes. Right.
And it's an assumption that if we assassinate the one, we take the head off, then we can get rid of the king that we don't like. Eventually, what happens in the West is instead of being the king being law, we turned it around to the law as king. The Magna Carta, the Constitution, ends up being a rule of law that runs our nation. We're no longer a government of men, but of law.
Right.
And everyone's under the law, including the president. And it's probably the best we can do until Jesus reigns, because when Jesus reigns, now we're going to have a king that, number one, will never be toppled, can't be killed, can't be assassinated. You know, he's going to be there forever. He's never going to be replaced, and he's going to be a righteous king that is going to rule with a rod of iron, and justice is going to flow down like water from a waterfall. We're going to see what the kingdom could have been if we had a king like Jesus, right? But until then, we're probably better off with a government where the law is king, instead of the king being law.
Right. Yeah. And even in the East, and even if, like, I'm studying a little bit on the Northern Kingdom, the same thing. They kill each other constantly, right? Only to get somebody even worse, right, to come in and take their place. And we see it, like I said, in the East, in the Middle East, and in Israel. That was never a solution, assassination. It usually created chaos, you know, so very good. Anybody else? Paul Chubb.
I just thought it was interesting.
But I think yeah, they want to hear you.
Oh, okay.
Carol will hear it at home.
Many years ago, I thought it was interesting. I was in Manhattan, and of around 59th, 60th Street, I think it was, there was a restaurant that I was in, the name of which? Serendipity.
Serendipity. I like that. Yeah, well, you know, the whole world, well, I shouldn't say that. A good portion of the world hangs their hat on serendipity and other things like that, and they look at their zodiac sign and they realize that only certain people they're connected to, because, you know, that's what the signs say, and you know, they follow tarot cards, and they believe in lucky rabbit's foot and lady luck and all the rest, and we know that we have a God in heaven who takes care of things, and there is no coincidence in luck. There is no serendipity when it comes to the Lord. He's taking care of all things, and He's superintending all things that go on in life. There is no accidents. There is no coincidence. So we did run out of time today. Does anybody have any other comments? So when we get together next week, Mary, we are going to have these notes next week. So I didn't get through them. So when you ask next week, are these the old notes? I can honestly say, yeah, we're on our old notes. I was like 2 weeks in a row, I think I got through my notes. So unfortunately not this week. So we'll pick it up on page 4 next week when we come back together. Mary.
Okay. Thank you for teaching about the hem of the garment. That was very, very interesting. And it just brought a question up in my own mind, because I thought about the woman who longed to touch the hem of Jesus' garment so that she could be healed. And we know he was a poor man, so he probably didn't have a hem like a king would have.
You might have had a frayed hem.
Yeah, and yet there is obviously something about Jesus, the person Jesus, as well as what he did, but the person Jesus that made her recognize his authority. to be able to heal her if she only just touched the hem of his garment.
That's right.
Yeah.
That was the hem. Good point. We do know that it was made of one cloth, one material, right? It wasn't stitched together or pieced together, because that's why they couldn't divide it properly, right? And the priestly garments is one, right? It's one material. It's not a couple of pieces stitched together. So that's very interesting that Jesus had a priestly robe on, during his life. But anyway, good. Yep, the hem, the very bottom of it, very, very important to understand those things, and then to make those correlations are really, really neat. If you have any questions about this week or something, a redirect that I might have to do, just let me know in between service as usual. No, we're going to start at, you can make the marker right where it says David entreats Saul, page 4. I'll mark it for you afterwards. I'll put a little star there, and we're going to start on page 4 next week. What's that? No, we didn't. We stopped here on page 4. Yeah, but we'll pick it up next week with those notes. All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for this study that we have through the book of 1 Samuel. It's quite a blessing to us, Lord. Help us to just apply these things to our life and just always be in awe and wonder of how you work in all circumstances. Of course, you're totally in control of the life of David and Saul, each making individual decisions, each choosing every day what to do, where to go. And yet, here we have a circumstance that occurs because of your great sovereignty and your divine will. And so we have this amazing interaction in the cave, Lord, and may it be a blessing to us as we think through those things. May we not just look at circumstances and make decisions. May we always go to you in prayer before we decide anything, and consult you in all of our decisions, especially ones that are very, very important in our life, Lord. And so be our guide, be our judge, be the one who influences us in all that we do. And I pray